Dyslexia is one of the most common forms of neurodivergence, impacting somewhere between 1 out of every 10 and 1 out of every 5 individuals, depending on where you get your information, and yet very little is actually known by the general population about what dyslexia even is. A lot of the time, people seem to think that it's either you just see letters backwards, you're really bad at school, or maybe even you're actually kind of an unintelligent person. But none of those things are really what dyslexia is. So what is it? Most simply put, dyslexia is a neurodevelopmental difference that impacts how the brain processes language, including reading, spelling, writing, and even speaking. When you compare the fMRIs of a non-dyslexic brain's reading to those of dyslexic brain's reading, what you'll find is that non-dyslexic individuals tend to rely on the occipital... My brain is trying to remember occipitotemporal and occipitotemporal and temporoparietal areas. And it's really struggling to keep those on the tip of my tongue, which is not shocking. When you compare the fMRI of a non-dyslexic person reading something to an fMRI of a dyslexic person reading something, you'll notice some differences. Non-dyslexic brains tend to activate the left posterior regions, including the occipital temporal and the temporoparietal areas of their brain to read, because those are key areas of the brain for word recognition and phonological or language processing. Versus when you look at the fMRI of a dyslexic person reading, what you'll notice is that they rely a lot more on the right hemisphere of the brain and some of the frontal regions. And the assumption that people come to based on comparing those two images is that dyslexic individuals end up developing different neural pathways for reading than non-dyslexic individuals, and those pathways that we develop tend to be less automatic and more effortful for us to use, which makes reading more effortful to do, and it makes it take more time often. So essentially, because dyslexic individuals don't use the most efficient part of the brain for processing language, our brains have to find other ways to do it that are less efficient and make it more challenging for us to do things like differentiate specific sounds in words or even recall words or how they're pronounced. It's also important to note that dyslexia exists on a spectrum, and no, that does not mean the autism spectrum, as I usually get asked on social media when I say anything about dyslexia existing on a spectrum. It means that for some people, they experience it rather mildly and it doesn't impact their reading or their spelling or anything very much. And for others, it has an extreme impact on their functioning and can be very disruptive. So now that we've talked a little bit about what dyslexia is, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the myths that people seem to believe about dyslexia that aren't actually true. First and foremost, dyslexia is not actually an eye problem. As much as there have been a lot of ophthalmologists who have peddled that it is an eye problem, it's not. And that's why glasses don't necessarily fix dyslexia. There is something known as Irlen syndrome that impacts how the brain processes what the eye sees, which seems more like a visual problem, and that often can be helped when people use things like color overlays over reading, but that's not actually dyslexia. And even still, that's not technically actually an eye problem. Another very common myth is that dyslexic individuals see everything backwards. And that's also not true. While we may write things backwards, like we may accidentally flip around some letters or not be able to tell you if you ask me like which way's an A, a B, a D, a P, or something like that. But no, we see things the same as everybody else. Another common myth about dyslexia is that dyslexia is linked to having a lower intelligence. And that's not actually the case. In fact, one of the criteria for being diagnosed with dyslexia or a specific learning disorder with impairment in reading, which is technically the clinical name for it, one of the criteria is that your issues with reading cannot be linked to a cognitive impairment. Because if you have a cognitive impairment that makes it so you struggle with reading, then you aren't dyslexic. Another funny one that I hear often on TV, because on reality shows, people will be like, oh yeah, when I was a child, I struggled with dyslexia then. Yeah, dyslexia doesn't go away when we get older. If you were dyslexic as a child, that is how your brain functions, and you will be dyslexic as an adult. And yes, the impact it has on you as an adult will likely be different than it was when you were a child, but if you were dyslexic, you are still dyslexic. It's not something that anyone grows out of. And the final myth is kind of the biggest and most overarching, which is that dyslexia is just about reading or spelling. It's not. It impacts our ability to organize things, it impacts our working memory, and it can even show up in our speaking and how we pronounce things and rapid word recall, as in our ability to remember specific words, or even mixing up things like left or right. All of those are very common issues that are experienced by dyslexic individuals that can actually kind of be connected to our dyslexia. I mentioned at the beginning of the video that dyslexia impacts between 1 in 10 and 1 in 5 people, because there is a range. Usually you'll find numbers that say somewhere between 10 and 20% of the population are dyslexic. But what's crazy about that, because that's a big number, that is, whether it is 10% of the population or 20% or anywhere in between, that represents millions and millions of people, even just in the US. What's crazy though is the number of those individuals who are undiagnosed, who don't even realize I'm dyslexic, who have struggled without understanding why they've struggled. Because the estimation is that somewhere between 40 and 80%, which is another huge range because we don't really have specific numbers for all this, but still, I would guess 40 to 80%, somewhere in there, I'm pretty sure is the accurate number. Either way, that's a huge number of people to be experiencing a struggle without understanding why they're struggling, which raises an important question: why is that the case? And there are several reasons. One, people just don't understand what it is or know what to look for. Another one is that dyslexic individuals often are pretty good at coming up with coping strategies to make it so that they can avoid getting detected. There's also just generally a lack of resources for actually trying to assess for or support people who are dyslexic in school. And finally, there's just not enough attention to go around. Like, one of the things that's really beneficial for dyslexic individuals, particularly as they're learning to read, is to get more of that one-on-one attention in supporting them and giving them access to learn how to read in a way that's effective for them. And because there's not enough people to always do that, a lot of people fall through the cracks. All of those are reasons that the more that the general population knows about dyslexia, the more we'll actually be able to identify and support individuals with dyslexia, which matters, because one of the conversations that's becoming more and more common about dyslexia isn't just about the deficit side, it's about all of the strengths that we really commonly see in dyslexic individuals. Things like being really good at big picture thinking, or the type of creativity that's involved in divergent thinking, which essentially means being able to come up with a lot of different options for how to use something, or a lot of different solutions for the same problem. Other things that dyslexic individuals tend to be really good at is like strong verbal reasoning. We tend to be fairly resilient and adaptable, highly empathetic. There are a lot of things in this list. That's not really what this video is about. But what matters here is that when dyslexic individuals are identified, and when we actually understand, oh, these are the reasons that I struggle, and we can get some of the support that can be really valuable, it can enable us to more lean into developing and nurturing our strengths, which is a really valuable thing, not just for us as individuals, but for society collectively. There are so many examples of people like Steve Jobs, Richard Branson, Agatha Christie, Whoopi Goldberg, like the list goes on of dyslexic individuals who have worked. The list goes on of dyslexic individuals who have contributed incredible things to society, and the more we support dyslexic individuals, the more common that story will become. Because when it comes to dyslexia, knowledge is power. Knowledge about dyslexia as a dyslexic person doesn't just let me know that I'm not alone, it lets me know that, oh, there are resources that exist to give me access to the knowledge or information that I so desperately want. There are resources that exist that enable me to be able to thrive and contribute what I can contribute. And for non-dyslexic individuals, whether you are parents, teachers, friends, or just anybody in the life of a dyslexic person, understanding more about dyslexia makes it so that we can all come together to create a more collaborative and supportive world, which is a really healthy and good thing. So if you or someone that you know struggles with reading, with writing, with spelling, it's worth looking into. Might dyslexia be a thing here? Because if it is, there are some incredible supports out there that can make a huge difference. Because as much as dyslexia often shows up in our reading and writing and spelling first, it impacts so much more of our lives than that. And the more about it we understand, the more effectively we can meet our needs and live as dyslexic individuals, really. So, thank you for being here. Thank you for watching this. I'm curious, was there anything that I said that surprised you? If there was, let me know in the comments down below. Otherwise, follow along as I make more content talking about dyslexia. Feel free to give this a like or comment, subscribe. Thank you for being here. Have a lovely whatever time of day it is, wherever you are.